DJ Norman Nite, who stepped up to the microphone 50 years ago during the era of rock and roll. Some of you might remember his oldies format show in the 70s on WGAR in Cleveland, dubbed the Night Train. Others might know his name from his weekend show on Sirius Radio featuring early rock and roll. But what most people don't know about Norman Nite is the important role he played in bringing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum to Cleveland. Norman Nite has worked in radio for over 50 years. He grew up on the south side of Cleveland listening to the early strains of rock and roll music. Songs like Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets, a huge hit in 1954, back when Norm was just 13 years old.
So many important things happened to you when those songs were popular. You went on your first date, maybe you got your first car, you graduated from high school, maybe you got married, you went off to college, you went off to military. All the important things in your life occurred during that time when you're listening to the music.
Like any teenager, Norm was drawn to the radio by this wild new rock and roll music. But there was something else that got his attention: the DJs.
What got me interested in radio growing up here in Cleveland, listening to Alan Freed back in 1951, and later on some of the other great disc jockeys that were here in Cleveland, like Pete Mad Daddy Myers and Johnny Walters, Johnny Holiday, Phil McLean, Bill Randall, all these people, they were just an inspiration to me because I heard them and I listened to what they did, and I saw the reaction to fans and teenagers at the sock hops I went to, and I said, gee, that'd be something interesting to get into one day.
That day came while Norman Anthony Derma was in the military. A first lieutenant in the U.S. Army during Vietnam, Norm had the unenviable task of informing the parents and loved ones that their son or daughter was mortally wounded. He was chosen because of his gentle demeanor, a quality that was also evident on the air. Like all DJs in that era, he needed an on-air name. He decided to call himself Norm in Nite. After his enlistment, he went to work at WHK and then WGAR in Cleveland, where he spun records for 4 years. But it's every DJ's dream to work in the #1 media market, and for Norman Nite, that dream came true in 1973 when he landed a job at WCBS in New York.
Norm fit right into WCBS FM. It was the first, if it wasn't, it was one of the first oldies FMs. And it was in the format long before that format became popular. It was only probably a handful of oldie stations in the country at the time.
I was in New York City at a time in CBS FM, which was the top station in New York in 1973, 74, 75, that particular time. And being on the air, I was working 6 to 10 p.m. prime time. Had the opportunity to meet and mingle with some of the biggest stars, John Lennon, this one, all of them.
Norm did more than just mix and mingle with celebrities. He interviewed hundreds of artists and used that gentle demeanor to delve into their lives and careers. One of the most memorable interviews was with his teenage idol, Bill Haley.
Do you realize when he was recording in 1951, Elvis Presley was driving a truck in Memphis? Little Richard was washing dishes at the Greyhound bus station. Chuck Berry was a beautician. So he was the first one to be able to start this whole thing called rock and roll, and in 128 seconds with Rock Around the Clock, created the anthem for rock and roll music. And to be able to say that you had a chance to spend time with Bill and talk to him and find out his thoughts about his music, his era, and everything else was something I just cherish.
He's a disc jockey with NBC Radio and the author of Rock On.
Nite has written a half-dozen books about the history of rock and roll and turned some of his interviews into documentaries. His album, Evolution or Revolution, was the first recorded history of rock and roll. Here's what Hank LeConte, owner of the Agora nightclub, had to say about Norm.
He had an interest that went beyond being a disc jockey. I've met a lot of disc jockeys. You know, they do their job, they go home. But he delved into it. I mean, this man went out and interviewed, I don't know how many hundreds of artists. And artists, I'm talking from the 50s. Artists that I remember quite well from being in the jukebox business. Almost every record that I put on a box, this guy interviewed them. And if he didn't interview them, he knew their life history.
Norm's knowledge of rock and roll earned him the nickname Mr. Music.
He became the go-to expert for a lot of folks about what this music was all about, where it came from. He became the sort of in-house resident guru of rock and roll.
When industry bigwigs in New York first started talking about building a museum dedicated to rock and roll, Norman Nite was offered a seat at the table. The first meeting took place in 1983.
We started having our weekly meetings. Word got back to my friend here in Cleveland, Hank LeConte, who runs the Agora, the fact that I'm involved with the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There's Cleveland there with these people.
Hank called Norm on behalf of a group that wanted the museum built in Cleveland.
And so I called Norman in New York.
We talked and he said, could you pitch Cleveland to the Rock and Roll, to the board at New York? I said, well, I'll try. That's what I can do, I can promise you. So I went back to New York and called up Ahmet Ertegun.
Ahmet Ertegun was a music industry giant. He was founder of Atlantic Records and, along with Jan Wenner, publisher of Rolling Stone magazine, the driving force behind establishing the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation.
And I said, Ahmet, would you consider Cleveland as a site for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? He says, absolutely not.
Norm didn't take no for an answer. He was the force at hand that kept saying, wait a minute, if it's going to be anywhere, it ought to be in Cleveland.
And I said, Ahmet, think about it. Alan Freed, it's a neutral city. It'll probably be cheaper. It's between Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York.
Because of his connections and his time spent in New York and knowing the record people firsthand, was very valuable in getting their attention and keeping Cleveland in the forefront that the Rock Hall be built here.
We worked diligently with Norm Nite, who was on the board of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame Foundation, and Norm convinced Ahmet Ertegun that all we were saying is give Cleveland a chance.
In 1986, Cleveland was selected as the site of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. At the first induction ceremony in New York, Norman Nite was asked to be a presenter to induct posthumously the man he idolized growing up in Cleveland, DJ Alan Freed.
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, and in 1950, 51, 52, I listened to Alan Freed playing those records on the Moondog Show.
Who else would they have got to induct Alan Freed? I mean, I can't think of anybody. It couldn't be an artist, because I don't know if Alan Freed was that close to any of them. It had to be a disc jockey.
From the Alan Freed Studios inside the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, Ohio, it's time to rock on with Mr. Music, Norman Nite.
128 seconds of rock and roll bliss.
Today, Norm is back in his hometown of Cleveland, still on the radio. He hosts a show on Sirius Radio from a place he knows all too well, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Museum.
I lived on Park Avenue. I had a house account at the 21 Club. I went to Studio 54 anytime I wanted to. I went and rode around in limousines, and I got to a point about the year 2000 where I started reflecting and saying, you know what? I would love to be able to come back to my own hometown where I grew up and do something for Cleveland. So the reason why I came back is because I wanted to do something for my own hometown, and I wanted to be able to take my contacts and things that I have been able to accomplish and focus them on being able to bring entertainers into town, do other things like that, and just, I love Cleveland. It's as simple as that. So I came back. You're talking to a guy who has a passion for his own hometown.
Well, please don't ask me what's on my mind. I'm a little mixed up.
More information about DJ Norman Nite can be found by clicking over to our homepage at applause.ideastream.org, where you'll find a link to Norm's website.
The chill I got, a little light.